Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a great honor for me to welcome you to CCG Global Dialogue Series events. Today, our guest is Professor Stephen Roach, Senior Fellow at Yale University, the former chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. Now, let's welcome Mabel Miao Lü, the Secretary General of CCG, to deliver the welcome remarks.
Your Excellencies, dear Professor Roach, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We are delighted to have all of you at the Center for China and Globalization be our CCG Global Dialogue. Today, our distinguished guest is Stephen Roach, Senior Fellow at Yale University and former Chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. Our dialogue today will focus on the theme, Global Economic Outlook and the Implications for China. CCG is China's leading international think tank with extensive global influence. CCG is the first Chinese social think tank to enter the global's top 100 and the first to obtain special consultative status with the United Nations. CCG launched the Global Dialogue Series in November 2020. CCG founder and president Dr. Huiyao Wang and the CCG other experts have engaged in in-depth dialogues with over dozens internationally renowned opinion leaders, including like Pascal Lamy, Lawrence Summers, Thomas Friedman, Martin Wolf, Graham Allison, Ray Dalio, Adam Paulson, Joseph Nye, Wendy Cutler, and many other senior policymakers, well-known think tank researchers, notable Chinese experts, prominent media figures, and many well-known figures around the world. I sincerely hope today's dialogue will also be great success. Now, please welcome the founder and president of Center for China and Globalization, former Council of State Council of China, Dr. Huiyao Wang, to introduce our distinguished guest speaker. Floor is yours, Dr. Wang.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Miao. And ambassadors, dear Steve, and of course our great friends and fellows and representatives, media circles, and all the people that gathered here at the Center for China and Globalization this afternoon. So we're very pleased to have another CCG Global Dialogue series. As Dr. Miao mentioned, we have conducted since 2020, and probably the most frequent global dialogue that broadcast internationally for the last several years. So today we are very pleased to welcome an old friend and very honored to welcome Steve Roach, the Senior Fellow at Yale University and also former Chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. So we're going to, the format is that we're going to have Steve Roach give us a keynote, then I'm going to have a dialogue with him, and then we're open for Q&A, and then of course we have this really a great discussion. I'd like to formally introduce Steve for his very impressive career. Professor Steve Roach served as a senior fellow at the Yale University Jackson Institute of Global Affairs for 13 years, actually, beginning in 2010 as a senior lecturer at the Yale School of Management. And in the fall of 2022, Steve joined the Yale Law School Paul China Center as a senior fellow. Of course, before coming to Yale, he was vice chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia and then the firm's chief economist for the bulk of his 30 years career at Morgan Stanley. So that's very long, and he lived many years in Asia and in Hong Kong and a frequent traveler to Beijing and China. He headed actually a highly regarded team of economists around the world. And so Steve's current teaching and research programs focus on the impacts of Asia on broader global economy. At Yale, where he's currently based now. He has introduced the new courses for undergraduates and the graduate students on the next China and the lessons of Japan. His writing and research has also addressed the globalization, trade policy, the post-crisis policy, and also capital markets implications of global imbalances. His works has actually appeared in academic journals, books, congressional testimony, and has been disseminated widely in the domestic and international media. So Steve's opinion on the global economy has been known to shape the policy debate from actually Beijing to Washington and vice versa. His latest book, Unbalanced, The Codependency of America and China, examines the risk and opportunity of what is likely to be the world's most important economy relationship in the 21st century. So also, of course, prior to joining the Morgan Stanley in 1982, which is 40-some years ago, Roach served as a research staff of the Federal Reserve Board and was also a research fellow at the Brookings Institution. So Steve holds a PhD in economics from New York University, and he's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and also a member of the investment committee at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the China Advisory Board of Environment Defense Fund, and also Economic Advisory Board at the University of Wisconsin. So just to name a few. So Steve actually is no stranger to China, but also he's an old friend of CCG. I remember as early as December 2016, we already invited Steve to give us a talk for the CCG organized luncheon. At that time, he discussed China's crucial role in the global economy and the importance of maintaining constructive Sino-US relations. Of course, as recent as December 2021, I had an extensive dialogue virtually with him during the COVID between myself and Steve, and our discussion covered a reflection of the Sino-US relationship, insights into the economic relations, and the causes of trade war between the two countries. And of course, that is still available on the YouTube and on the CCG website. I remember very well Steve was saying, China and the US should set up a joint working office, secretary office, either in Geneva or somewhere, really to tackle daily China-US relations. So that is a brilliant idea, and I really like that. So I think, last time that I met Steve, he was at the China Development Forum. He was a frequent participant of China Development Forum, and he has many ideas. I mean, we see a lot of his new thinking, and I would like to find out what his latest thinking. So we're having this CCG afternoon, CCG Global Dialogue, that really welcome Steve to give us his latest thinking. And so without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Roach to give us his keynote. Let's welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry, for your kind remarks. And it's a pleasure to be back here in front of CCG and try to stimulate some thinking on China, its role in the world economy. The conventional wisdom is that China is the world's most powerful engine of economic growth. And I think that has been true for a number of years. But I think we need to rethink that dynamic between China and the world in China. My thesis that I want to just lay out for you today with the support of a few slides that I've brought with me is that the engine, the Chinese global growth engine, is not as powerful as it used to be. There are some new sources of global growth that are evident, but even they are not enough to give the world the same type of support that we have become accustomed to. And the U.S.-China conflict, which is an ongoing subject of my own writing and research, represents probably the single greatest threat to the overall global growth dynamic in the years ahead. So how do we get my slides up there? Okay. So this is a busy slide, but it shows you a couple of things. One, the IMF's latest projections of global growth through the year 2029, and two, a couple of horizontal lines, one drawn at 3.5%, the black line on the top, which represents the trend rate of growth in the world economy since 1960. And then the red line at 2.5%, below which the world is normally considered to be in a global recession. The forecast looks okay between now and 2029, but it's most importantly below trend. And when the world is growing below trend, it lacks the cushion that is normally required to deal with shocks should they occur, and that leaves the world vulnerable to the onset of a new recession. The China outlook is a very different outlook than we are accustomed to in examining your long, dynamic, and major source of global growth. On the left, the solid black line is the 5-year trend in Chinese GDP growth. And it's moving steadily lower and projected to do so between now and 2029. The peak 5-year growth rate was 11.7% in the year 2007. And by the end of the forecast period, that number is projected to be 3.8%. That is a dramatic slowdown by any account that you can think of. And the slowdown can be broken down into short-term or cyclical pressures, such as the property crisis, or longer-term structural issues that I will talk about shortly that have to do with demography, total factor productivity, and geostrategic conflict with the United States. The property problem is China's major cyclical growth impediment in my view. And the government has just announced a new property support package. In my humble opinion, it's a step in the right direction, but it is not nearly large enough to absorb the excess inventory on the supply side of your housing market. The lending support package of the PBOC isn't adequate to take up the outsized inventory of housing stock that is now overhanging the supply side of the Chinese property market. At Yale, I've taught 2 courses over the years that bear on this issue. One is a big class on the Chinese economy, and a second seminar is on the lessons of Japan. And if you study the lessons of Japan carefully, you will note that the property crisis, which lasted for 18 and a half years in Japan, was a major impediment to the recovery of the Japanese economy in the aftermath of the lost decades of the 1990s and early 2000s. And by many measures, the property problems in China are every bit as large as those which we saw in Japan, and we are only in the very early stages of addressing that problem. It took 19 years to address the Japanese property problems. The structural issues in China are also, surprisingly, quite Japanese-like. I show you two major structural issues that are now afflicting the Chinese economy: the aging of the population. The working age population, of course, peaked in the year 2015, and the recent decline in total factor productivity. In my lectures on Japan, I have the same confluence of structural problems that I can show you, but I'm not going to show them to you today in the interest of time. I want to assure you the chart looks identical. The only difference is it took place 20 years earlier in Japan. The way we do economics from a growth accounting point of view is when a nation is faced with a demographic problem of an aging population, the only way you can maintain rapid economic growth is to offset the demographic headwinds through increased productivity growth. Japan was unable to do that, and I worry about China's capacity to do that as well. TFP, as you see, has been declining actually since the year 2011, in large part reflecting the fact that much of Chinese economic activity is now taking place in low productivity SOEs, and the private sector, which has historically been a strong source of productivity growth in China, is now feeling the pressures of regulatory restraints, especially in the internet platform area. So these two conditions make China sort of a worrisome parallel of what we saw in Japan, where the headwinds from an aging population will not be offset by an increase in productivity of those that are still on the job. So, you know, this is a long chart here. I'm not saying that China is the next Japan, but there are clearly some worrisome parallels as seen from the standpoint of asset bubbles, debt intensity, the incidence of corporate zombies, the aging, the demography, and of course, conflict with the U.S. Japan was in conflict with the U.S. on trade policy in the late 80s, and now it's China. The U.S. always needs to blame somebody for its growth problems, and we like blaming large Asian nations. One other thing about the Japan comparison that I will leave you with, and then move on to the topic at hand, the global growth dynamic, is the notion of the Chinese growth shock itself. On the surface, it doesn't seem to be a big deal. I mean, you can see what happened in Japan, 45 years, the green bar on the left, of 7.25% growth, and followed by 45 years of less than 1% growth. China has slowed, but in no way is that slowing as severe as that which is evident in, has been evident in Japan. But it is all relative. And what you see on the right is the difference between the growth comparisons in the high growth period, Japan and China, versus that which has occurred recently in Japan and that which is projected to occur over the next 5 years in China. If you take that IMF forecast as an accurate projection of what is to come, and you can argue against that, the deceleration of Chinese economic growth plotted on the right is almost identical to that which has happened in Japan since 1991. That's a growth shock, whether you want to admit it or not. And when there's a growth shock, that sort of changes everything. The idea that you can count on rapid growth as the rising tide that sort of masks all underlying problems, that gets drawn into serious question. And if the IMF forecast is correct on looking out over the next 5 years of China, maybe you're more optimistic than that, so it's less of a concern, but I'm not, then the possibility of a Chinese growth shock being comparable to that experienced in Japan is something you need to take very seriously. So what's all that mean to world economic growth? This graph measures the cumulative contribution of China to global growth. And you can see something very interesting about this, and that bar, the second bar from the left, shows the Chinese growth contribution at its maximum, close to 33%, from wait, I just gotta, sorry, from 2010 to 2019. No, that's, yeah, maybe I'll do that, yeah. Thank you. From 2010 to 2019. Then came COVID, and post-COVID, the Chinese contribution to global growth has slowed dramatically. The 32 went down to about 24, and again, on the basis of the IMF's forecast, it's going to drop further to about 21% over the 3 years, 2027 to 2029. And so China is still the most powerful engine in the world, but the power of the engine is diminishing. And the idea that, we're talking about China as being, in and of itself, enough to account for over 30% of global growth, that needs to be rethought. Who's filling the void? Well, India is trying, and if you look around the world for new sources of global growth, you can see that the Indian source, which was, 1/3 of that of China's in the 2010 to 2019 interval, when China's impetus to global growth was at its maximum, that Indian source is almost doubling by 2027 to 2029, when the Chinese growth contribution is slowing. I'm optimistic on India. I'm not as, historically, I have not been as optimistic on India as I have been on China, but there's a lot of attention being given to India right now as a new source of global growth, and it's something we need to look at very carefully in the years ahead. The rest of the world, I'm afraid to say, doesn't really matter. I mean, you look at the U.S. share, it's been roughly stable around accounting for 10% of global growth for a long period of time. I'm sorry, I know we have an ambassador here from Europe, but Europe is even less consequential in making a contribution to global growth in the United States. And then if you look elsewhere in the world, Japan, ASEAN, Latin America, Middle East, I mean, they barely show up on the chart. So if you're looking at the global growth dynamic, recently, currently, and prospectively, China, US, and India, those are the three sources that will matter the most. And I stressed here this afternoon that the Chinese growth engine is not going to be what it used to be. The final thing I want to talk to you about, though, is the impact of conflict, especially US-China conflict, on the global growth dynamic. This is a worrisome development and potentially a big deal. For the Chinese economy itself, the export share of the Chinese economy has come down dramatically from its peak in 2007, but it's on the rise recently. And Xi Jinping, in his latest policy pronouncements, is placing major emphasis on manufacturing-led, export-led growth in China, especially in the advanced technology and in the capital goods area. The U.S., at the same time, has resisted Chinese export growth, and thanks to former President Trump, who, as you know, was convicted of 34 felony charges today in New York, we are in the midst of a major trade war with China that was sparked by President Trump, but continued under the Biden administration. These are U.S. tariffs on Chinese products, which were virtually nothing, and they're still holding at about 19.3% of overall imports from China today. And China, of course, has reciprocated, and that has had a significant impact on Chinese demand for U.S.-made goods. The Biden administration has, as I said, continued to prosecute Donald Trump's trade war. And I find this, I'm trying to be fair. I'm not being either supportive of a Republican or a Democrat. I'm critical of both. When President Biden took office on January 20th, 2021, he signed 17 executive orders that unwound some of the most unpopular acts of the Trump administration. The trade wall, the border wall with Mexico, the travel ban on Muslims, U.S. Getting out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, the World Health Organization. He reversed all of that, but he did not unwind Trump's tariffs. And a few weeks ago, he announced a further expansion of tariffs under this provision of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974, known as Section 301. And the most worrisome aspect of those tariffs, I think, were in these areas involving Chinese production of alternative energy products, batteries, electric vehicles, and solar cells. There's a number of other items that are the tariffs are increasing. The point's been made, don't worry about electric vehicles. The tariffs are going to 100%, but the U.S. doesn't buy too many cars, electric cars made in China, at least not yet. I think this is a huge strategic mistake driven by election year politics in the United States. The world is in the grips of a horrific climate problem, desperately in need of new solutions through alternative non-carbon fueled energy products. To take a protectionist stand against a country like China that has a comparative advantage in producing the non-carbon alternative energy products that a world in the grips of climate change desperately needs is a blunder potentially of historic proportions in my view. It is precisely the wrong thing at the wrong time, and an example of how poisonous politics can be in shaping trade policy for the world's leading nation. President Biden has made a big deal about ending America's, what he called forever wars. That was the rationale that he used for getting out of Afghanistan in the summer of 2021. I worry that he is getting himself even deeper into a new forever war against Chinese trading practices. The U.S. continues to make the same mistake on trade policy today that it made with Japan, and that is putting pressure on one nation at a time when it really faces a trade balance that's made up of many, many nations. We call it a multilateral trade balance. You can't fix a multilateral problem by putting bilateral pressure on one of your trading partners. We have a multilateral trading problem because we have big budget deficits that depress our domestic saving. When economies don't save and they want to grow, they import surplus savings from abroad. They run massive current account and trade deficits with many, many nations to attract the foreign capital. And so what has happened in the United States is we've done to China what we did to Japan in the late 80s. We've reduced the Chinese share of our trade deficit, just like we reduced the Japanese share. The Chinese share of our trade deficit has gone down sharply from a peak of about 50% in 2015 to about 21% last year. But our budget deficit's gotten bigger, our domestic saving has gotten lower, and so the result is all we've done is we've diverted trade away from China toward other nations that have picked up the slack, and those nations are listed right here: Mexico, Vietnam, Canada, South Korea, Taiwan, India, Ireland, and Germany. And if you decompose their share of U.S. imports, 70% of that collection of nations are higher cost producers than the U.S. So our trade policies are actually imposing the functional equivalent of tax hikes on American workers. Again, an example of the poisonous impact of politics on trade policy. We did it with Japan, we're doing it again with China. And that gets me back to where I started with, and that is the global economic outlook. I showed you in that first slide that global growth doesn't really have the cushion that it would need to withstand the pressures of an unexpected shock. What this slide shows you is that we've had a shock in the global economy, the list is too long to go through, but basically every 2 to 3 years. And given the mounting pressures on the U.S.-China trade front, you cannot rule out the possibility of another shock in the next year or so. Markets are not priced for that. That's what this chart on the right shows. And the global economic outlook, this is a forward-looking forecast of world economic growth. It's the weakest that it's been since the early 1990s. And so the possibility of an unpleasant surprise in global growth cannot be ruled out in light of this mounting conflict between the United States and China. And Henry mentioned a book I wrote a number of years ago. What he didn't mention was a book I wrote last year that can be ordered on Amazon right now as you're sitting there. It's called Accidental Conflict, and it focuses on the risks, the mounting risks of conflict between the United States and China in light of the Trump tariff wars that have been prosecuted further by President Joe Biden, and makes the case that unless something major is done to bring our nations together, and Henry mentioned my proposal for establishing a U.S.-China Secretariat, which I continue to be very much in favor of, that the possibilities of accidental conflict are something to take very seriously. And with pressures building to this very day in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, the new tariffs that President Biden is imposing on China, this is something to take very seriously and something that we must stand up and say no to today if we are serious about defending the strength and resilience of the global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, for your excellent presentation. I think it's really very helpful for all of us to have a better understanding of what's going on. And I think you outlined the global growth and what China's contribution can be and continue to be challenges, opportunities, but also you talk about the experience of other nations like Japan, India, and then you talk about continuously what are the problems that we're having now. So this is great. I mean, this is very good overview. And now we want to get into a dialogue section. And I would like to ask you some questions. First, you mentioned about this IMF forecast. I think that was very interesting because IMF actually recently they mentioned that projected growth for 2024 will be 5%, right? Up from 4.5%. Actually, I know 4.5% in 2025. So they actually increased their projection by 0.4%, and so this is interesting. But also you mentioned those, of course, the trend is coming down, and so the question I would like to ask is that, of course, China, with the magnitude, with the size of its economy and such a big second largest economy, they cannot, when the bases are low, they have a lot of a big percentage. But even now today, even 5% or 4.5%, probably equal to 10% 10 years ago, or 15% 20 years ago. So every year there's a large equivalent of, I don't know if it's Australia or Indonesia GDP added to China, and also the other thing is they are now from high speed growth to high quality, and so For example, I remember many years ago, they were talking about 700 million shares to exchange for one Boeing 747. Now China become the largest automobile exporter in the world. So there's a lot of quality changes. How do you interpret that? Even though the speed may come down, but the quality may picked up, and that is still needed. And then how we can really continue that kind of a from high speed to high quality, and what are the things we still need to be cautious of, and how we can really continue that positive momentum, even though we are not achieving the high speed we used to have.
Well, you touch on a few things, Henry. One, the IMF's forecast revision. Half a point, in the way that forecasting accuracy goes these days, it's an upward revision, but it doesn't change the basic story of an economy that is still growing at best about half the pace that it did in the high growth era when the Chinese economy grew 10% for 31 years from 1980 to 2011. You're right that as the base gets bigger, smaller increments mean more. But my point on the growth shock that I tried to end with is that this has been abrupt. The slowdown has been concentrated in the last few years, and when China was growing rapidly for much, much longer than anybody thought, the expectations were built in that China and the world could count on rapid growth, irrespective of the base effects going forward. And this notion that the leadership continues to boast about in addressing global forums like the China Development Forum, and I heard Premier Li say this at the China Development Forum at the end of March, that China accounts for, I think the number he used was 35% of global growth. That's out of date. That number is no longer accurate, and it's going to get smaller. Your final point, though, is, I think, the most important, and that is moving away from a focus on the quantity to the quality of growth. I've had the privilege and the opportunity of making speeches in this country for every year of the last quarter century, and I've always pounded the table on precisely that, shifting from a fixation on quantity to improved quality of economic growth. How do we measure the quality of economic growth? You can measure it through environmental metrics, and I was delighted to wake up this morning and drive across town and see a beautiful blue sky in Beijing, and I think there has been some improvement in air quality in China over the last, 10 years. My favorite scientific metric for quality, though, is total factor of productivity. And the trend there is worrisome. From the 2011 to 2019 period, a 10-year period, TFP growth, as we call it, has been dropping by a little over 1% a year. And that follows a big upsurge in the prior 15 years. And that is a worrisome sign of deteriorating quality of Chinese economic growth because it raises questions about the efficiency of labor and capital in generating sustained growth in overall economic output. You cannot have high quality growth with weak TFP. And a final metric to think about, and it gets a lot of discussion in China, is measures of the equality or inequality of the income distribution. And the conclusion is pretty straightforward based on most metrics that China, and China's not alone in this respect, certainly has problems with mounting income inequality as well.
Thank you, Steve. Excellent point. I think absolutely. I think we need to address all those inequality and that common prosperity. That is really China. The better life of the people is really the target of a government to strive for. And so while maintaining high quality, we have to maintain equality. So that's really a good point. But I'd like to also touch upon the other issue you raised. You talk about Japan, you talk about the aging population, and then whether China going to repeat what Japan has gone through, and also what are the impetus, what are the next drive for the Chinese economy. The real estate market is also mentioned that it's slowing down. And so, what are the next biggest transformative policy that the government can propose? So here, I'd like to discuss a bit of our thinking with you. Is that, for example, we have the third planning of the 20th Party Congress is going to have in July. We are expecting a lot of new policies. We are thinking. You talk about real estate. Premier Li mentioned at the China Development Forum in March this year that urbanization of 300 million migrant workers would be probably the big next drive. So I'm thinking, how we can translate that into a concrete policy in addition to trade-in and other policies. I'm thinking of, for example, in the last 45 years of China opening up, there's every 10 years, there's always a revolutionary policy that drives up the process. For example, in the 80s, the government had a policy of contract the land for the farmers to grow whatever they like, to break away of a planned economy, and we changed the Chinese society from a society of a shortage to a society of abundance. So that policy has really changed China dramatically. And then second decade policy was that government realized, the real estate market in the cities, why can't we allocate the flats for the workers and the citizens, urban residents in the cities? Privatize that almost, very minimum cost. And so everybody in the city has apartment or buy apartment. That actually cultivated the 400 million middle class. And then in the year of 2000 afterwards, China joined WTO. It's another revolutionary policy where they have, there's a handful of SOE does the trade, did the trade, but now, 6 million companies can conduct foreign trade, and China become the largest trading nation in the world. So for the last 10, 15 years, we are thinking, where are the next low-hanging fruit revolutionary policy that we can tap into? So Premier Li's actually, his comment at the China Development Forum stimulated me to think. We are now have urbanization. You also mentioned in your presentation about, Japan, other countries, 80%, or Western country, US. China is only 66%, according to the Premier Li. But only 50% has the hukou and city resident benefit. The other 16 does not have it. So we talk about 300 million migrant workers live in the city, but they are not enjoying the city rights. So the reason for that is they have a household land in a rural area. So the rural area household land is empty with seniors and youngsters, but also they are renting a big, lot of apartments in the city. So there's a lot of redundancy and waste. So I'm thinking, if we can really, like in the 90s, privatize the apartment for the workers, can we, allow the farmers who are already settled in the city to sell their household land in a rural area, and so that they can get first startup capital to buy the real estate second-hand down payment in the cities, and avoid this 9 billion people travel around during the Chinese New Year visiting each other. and also to adjust, to make social justice. So would that be a lowing hand for the biggest policy that we can hope for? And I would like to hear your comments on that. Thank you, Steve.
I think it's a great idea, Henry. I like your thinking. I would like to broaden it out, though, because you introduced this by saying every 10 to 15 years, there's a big change that injects new energy, a new source of growth into China. And I have been pounding the table for longer than I care to remember about the need for a new impetus to household sector private consumption in China. The numbers are very clear. The latest share of Chinese GDP going to private household consumption is below 38%. 38%, that's ridiculously low. Now, your proposal goes right to one aspect of that, and that is to the 300 million migrant workers who clearly have the potential to be tapped as a new source of consumption. I would say that that is necessary but not sufficient. So I'm endorsing you. But I would say of equal significance would be the need to really inject much more funding and vitality into the social safety net, healthcare and retirement, because I think that is the biggest impediment to discretionary consumption, because it keeps families who are aging rapidly predisposed toward precautionary saving in providing for the future. And to the extent that a non-significant portion of those families lack hukou because of their residency preference, that would be additive to that problem. So I would combine the two into a much broader program aimed at injecting new stimulus into private household consumption in China. I think it's a good idea, but it's not enough on its own. Just say one other thing about the current Chinese policy strategy. Like you, I was also at the China Development Forum and heard Premier Li address policy priorities for China. And he repeated a theme that he had emphasized in his work report a month earlier to the National People's Congress, saying that the real priority, the most important priority, is focusing on new productive forces aimed at boosting manufacturing and, in particular, a new round of export-led growth in China. He mentioned, in addition to that, the need to stimulate domestic demand along the lines of what you and I have been talking about. The first priority, though, is one that is clearly causing a lot of negative reaction in the U.S., increasingly in the G7, and it's all wrapped up in this excess capacity debate that I alluded to in my own comments. So, this twofold strategy is important for China, but it creates conflicts that I think are also problematic in shaping the growth outlook in this country.
Great, thank you, Steve. Absolutely, I agree. You mentioned that we should really have new a strong impetus or stimulus or revolutionary policy that badly needed, not by China, but also for the world. I think real estate is one of the biggest factors because in the Chinese traditional thinking, if you have a piece of asset, then you are confident you're going to spend more. You're not going to take the wallet close to your chest and then withhold from spending. So I think stabilize the real estate market is crucial. And actually in China, I read somewhere there's an apartment built enough to house 200 million people. So 300 million migrant workers, if we move them to the cities and let them have a legitimate identity to live in the cities, they're going to contribute to the stability of China. Now, I'd like to ask you another question. You mentioned about just now new productive courses, new quality productive forces. Interesting, you also mentioned the tension on those tariffs. President Biden raised on the EV cars, batteries, and the solar, all those new green energy technology and products. Actually, according to the International Atomic Agency, in order to combat climate change, according to the Paris Accord, we probably need more, like at least 800 gigawatts of new green power to combat. And now we can only produce a quarter of that. And then the world needs to spend $4.5 trillion a year on the green spending. The world is only spending 1.8 trillion, far from oversupply. So I was even reading that the European government is considering to extend their, phasing out of the diesel gasoline-driven car. Originally it said by 2035, now it's extend to 2040 because they want to extend the life of diesel and the gasoline car. So if we are having a changing climate so badly, and it's really strange to see that U.S. and even sometimes Western countries are so calling for more products, more technology available to combat the climate change. Now China has developed that. Now they're refusing to have it, and they even put tariff on that. And 90% of the commercial flights is supplied by Boeing and Airbus. We don't see it's overcapacity. So I just want to get your opinion from non-Chinese. What do you think about, we are urgently need green products in this world. And China, after so many years of experiment, hard working and trial, and of course with opening up of help of every country, now to have this product available, now the country says, no, you are overcapacity. So what do you think? What's your take on this question?
I think it borders on insanity. In a world that is facing unmistakable signs of climate change, there is no such thing as excess capacity in non-carbon green energy products. If anything, there is a shortage of alternative energy products. China is providing an enormous service and a benefit to the world in producing low-cost, clean energy products that the world desperately needs to protect itself against the ravages of climate change. China has the technology, the scale, and therefore, by definition, the comparative advantage in delivering exactly what a climate-torn world needs. And we resist this purely for political pressures because we have this desire led by the United States to contain Chinese economic growth and development. We also have, as you have in China, national security concerns. I can think of no greater threat to national security than destabilizing the world's climate. And so if we're serious about looking at national security, or from the standpoint of the security of our planet, we need to be, I think, much more appreciative of the need to allow nations that have comparative advantage in giving the world what it needs support rather than resistance.
Thank you for your very good views that look at this issue. So I appreciate that. And absolutely, the world is is really burning. We need to really work together. Also, in you mentioned about the book you have. This would be my last question. I would like to open it up, but I'd like to ask you this question before I do so. You mentioned about the book, Accidental Conflict, American, China, and the Clash of False Narratives, which is exactly right on, because you gave me that book last year. I read it. I found it very fascinating. The perception of both countries, China and the West, and the US, and then, of course, the narratives are totally different. And so how can we really get more right narratives, of course? I mean, you talk about, for example, national security. There's too much emphasis on the national security now. There's driving up, all those things. But equally important, even more important, climate security, food security, energy security, environment security, and
health security.
Health security, absolutely. The benefiting of the mind, human security. We recently had just a big symposium in Washington talk about human security. So I think those are really important. So how can we really gradually have the right narrative and have a global governance for those common concerns, rather than we develop into two camps? There's more security alliance built up, but on the other hand, China's doing a lot of economic alliance for the globalization. So how can we really converge that, and then maybe, China and the U.S. has a moral responsibility for the mind conflict, the human security. So exactly, I like the idea of a secretary office of a secretary for the China-U.S. relation. It'd be right on.
Well, let me just give you my theory behind your important question, Henry. When I started working on this book 4 or 5 years ago, I started out with some of the ideas that I summarized on the slides today, and that is that we have, in the United States, many false impressions about China. And then as I did the research, I said, wait a second. There's a number of false impressions that China has about the United States as well. And the reason that both nations have false impressions or false narratives about each other, and they have such important impacts on the policy actions that we take toward one another, is because of politics. We let political pressures drive wrong directional policies, in my view. That's true of trade policy in the US, and it's true of China's concerns about America's threat to its national sovereignty. So what I end the book on is recognizing that the politically driven process of engagement that both nations have embraced since the early 1970s is more driven by politicians than by technocrats. And politicians tend to operate on the basis of appealing to workers or promising their citizens a better life, and they get us into trouble. So my proposal is for a new organization that I call a U.S.-China Secretariat that really changes the architecture of engagement between the two superpowers takes it out of the hands of the politicians, the leaders who are driven by their own personal political agendas. With all due respect, you have that same problem that we do, and puts it in the hands of technocrats who have a broad remit to deal with all aspects of the relationship, not just when the leaders meet once a year, but 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they deal with trade, economics, innovation policy, technology transfer, industrial policies, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, the big existential issues like health, cyber, climate. It's an organization that is built around a collaborative model of research based on a common, mutually agreed upon database. It's an organization that collectively works on the oversight and compliance of existing bilateral agreements. And should disputes arise, it screens disputes and has a built-in dispute resolution mechanism. We need a new architecture of engagement. The current structure is creating conflict as opposed to conflict resolution. And if we don't get serious about addressing our mutual issues, we will not have conflict resolution. We'll continue to have conflict escalation, and that is the biggest risk of accidental conflict. We've got to change it.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's absolutely crucial. I'm all for this proposal. You know, China, U.S. should really have a close working team. And also, you mentioned about the policy on both sides. Absolutely, I think, you know, we see this the U.S. of course because of globalization affecting many working class, and then, you know, but the real estate, the Wall Street is really making, you know, hitting all-time high. And the 1% of Wall Street is equal to the 40-50% of the mass population in the U.S. And then the gap is big. There's a lot of social injustice. But then we cannot really have that all blamed on China because, you know, the business is making all the
Politicians need someone to blame.
That's right.
That's why, again, I'm not in favor of a political solution to the type of superpower conflict that we have.
Absolutely. So I think on that note, I think we'll finish our dialogue. But I think I totally agree. We should increase dialogue, you know, mutual exchanges, and of course, and create a new narrative of the China and the U.S. had a huge responsibility for the human security and for the future to come. So now I'll open for the question. I know the China Daily report is here. Is that right? And also I have a Beijing Daily and China Information Center and Global People Magazine. So anybody wants to start? Okay, we have this. We have this. There's three in a row. Okay, there's. Okay, okay, from backwards is fine.
First of all, my name is Yisun Zheng. I'm a reporter from the Global People magazine. So I hope to thank CCG for organizing this event. I have two questions, if it's okay. So my first question is, so we actually had an interview with Professor Roach about 11 years ago. And back then, like Professor Roach said, he's a long-term optimist of the Chinese economy. So I'm wondering, is right now, are you still believe this? So, and my second question is about the Sino-American relations. So, Professor Roach and Ms. Wang discussed like there are certain false impression of China and the U.S. have on each other. But what we see is, so when facing economic difficulties, China have a greater consensus on thinking like the cooperation with the U.S. will be a solution of the economic stagnation. When the U.S. politicians tend to believe the relationship with China is a threat to their economic development. So I think this is a great difference. So like in this situation, do you both think, in your both perspective, do you think the current trade dispute between China demonstrated a long-term trend in the U.S. Foreign policy towards China, or it is more like a short-term policy. It is just a symptom that the U.S. politician is trying to adjust to a new reality of the bilateral relationship between China and the U.S. Thank you.
Yeah, those are good questions. Let me deal, first of all, with my own view. If I met you 11 years ago and I said I was optimistic over the long term, 11 years is a long term. So, you know, I stayed optimistic probably for 10 of those 11 years. That's a long time, right? I think, you know, more seriously, my outlook is certainly more cautious today than it was back then, and in fact, more cautious right now with respect to China going forward than it has been at any point in the 25 years I've been actively involved in your following your economy, both living here and from abroad. And I've changed my view in the last year or so, in large part for the reasons I mentioned in my presentation. The demographic changes are happening much more quickly than we thought. The UN demographic projections as recently as 2 to 3 years ago called for Chinese population to peak in 2031. It happened in 2021, 10 years earlier. And number two, the TFP issue, total factor productivity. The trends have been weak, and they're an outgrowth of conscious policy choices that the Chinese government has made, not only to throw more support behind low productivity SOEs, but to put tighter regulations on higher productivity private sector, especially internet platform companies. And the third and final consideration in my shift has to do with my deep-rooted concerns about the U.S.-China conflict, which have really gone from bad to worse over the last few years, which gets me to your second question on the conflict itself. There are different perceptions on both sides of the relationship about the role that each nation can play in supporting or in constraining each other's prosperity. You're entirely correct. The Washington view is that China is a threat to long-term prosperity. China has not had that view about the United States until, I would say, the last year. It was a year ago at the National People's Congress in early 2023 when President Xi underscored for the first time his concern that U.S.-China policies were now posing the long-term threat of suppression all around the containment of China's growth and development objectives. And this represents a shift in his point of view as well. And so both of these perceptions, they come from different places, but they end with the same emphasis on mutually shared perceptions of conflict, which I think are worrisome for the long-term stability of our economic and political relationships. There's still, I think, good spirit on a people-to-people basis, but even that over time, I think, becomes adversely affected if the economic and political and trade and technology conflict continues to deepen.
Yeah, no, I had maybe add a little bit on that. Is that I feel that Chinese economy, as you mentioned, the aging population, demographic changes, and all those things. But on the other hand, there's more synergy now. You have the best infrastructure in the world. You have 70% of the 5G networks. You have a 12 million freshly graduate single-child, well-educated talent pool, and of course you have all the 1.1 billion smartphone users. So there's a lot of productivity. For example, China already become a cashless society, and then the productivity is at all-time high, probably in terms of certain areas. So I'm not that pessimistic, but I think things could change. As for China-U.S. relation, of course, President Xi also mentioned you have 1,000 reasons to be in good relations, not a single reason to be in bad relation. I think China was responding more to the U.S. hostile policy, but still, we want to maintain good relations. President Xi even invited 50,000 American young people to come to China. So let's hope for the best. The second, the gentleman from Bloomberg, I suppose, yeah.
Hi, I'm James from Bloomberg. I have a question about overcapacity, but I wanted to sort of step away from the three news or the new energy products you were talking about and look more broadly at the economy. If you look at steel production, or if you look at all the things that go into housing, production is still the same level as it was before the Three Red Lines policy was brought in. We're looking at 1 billion tons of steel being produced this year, but demand for that domestically is nowhere near where it was. And so that's being exported. And so March steel exports are at a record. You're seeing petrochemical exports for plastics and also other things. Also, things that can't be used in housing anymore in China are being exported. But if you think about the green transition and the decarbonization, excess steel capacity and excess steel production is steel production is a big driver of carbon emissions. So it would seem that China is exporting these products because it continues to produce domestically, even though there really isn't a need for it to even be making these products in the first place. And then making those products is leading to greater carbon emissions. So sort of thinking about the overcapacity question more broadly than just batteries and EVs and solar panels, do you think that there needs to be more done in China to deal with the capacity issues that are being seen in the industrial economy? And my second question is on the tariffs that the US has put in place specifically. The argument of the USTR and the government is that they're providing space for domestic industry and for foreign investment to build those same sectors in the US that China built over the last 10 years in China. Do you not agree that, their argument is that this will lead to production of these products in the US, which will eventually drive down prices because it will lead to a competitive industry in the US and also in China. Do you not think that that is a useful policy choice that they are trying to make? And over the long term, do you think that that will lead to cheaper prices for these goods globally? Thank you.
Well, I think that there are certainly areas, and you point to steel, where there is a supply-demand imbalance domestically that is being reflected in sending that supply out into foreign markets. I would argue that that is a symptom of a bigger problem in China, and that is letting too much of the industrial sector now being supported and driven by state-owned enterprises that are less susceptible to market pressures that might otherwise promote a more rational balance between supply and demand. And I think the emphasis on SOE-led industrial activity does create inefficiencies with important global repercussions, and that just underscores the need for intensified efforts at SOE reforms that over time I think would begin to alleviate that type of problem. The rationale that you describe for putting up barriers to protect nascent green energy production in the developed world, I reject that completely. I think if anything, it will make the competitive pressures less intense, as protectionism always does. And I think the cost differential US, China, EU, China on EVs, batteries, even solar panels is so wide that protectionism, all that will do, I think, will again keep the global price level higher than would otherwise be the case. So I think this is a tax on precisely the types of products that a world afflicted with climate change needs more than ever, and I would not be in favor of that or support that type of rationale to just, quote, give us time to catch up.
Thank you. Okay, we have the lady in the front. Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm a journalist from China Internet Information Center. And the first question, you have just stressed the importance of total factor productivity. You said that China cannot achieve the high quality growth with a weak total factor productivity. So what are the suggestions for Chinese government to improve total factor productivity? And the second question, how would you evaluate the trade relation between China and the US? How would you evaluate the impact of the US election on China-US trade relations? Thank you.
TFP policies, again, there's a long debate of this in the economic and policy literature, and investing in human capital, innovation, all part of the agenda, and these are areas where I think China is in very good shape to boost TFP. My theme that I have underscored several times today is to shift the mix of economic support away from low productivity SOEs to higher productivity private sector, especially technology companies. Without doing that, many of the other things that are being achieved so successfully in China will just get lost in the equation. That would be my single most important objective. In terms of the election, what we've seen from President Biden, as I indicated in my presentation, has been a surprising and disappointing continuation of the protectionist approach that was sparked by President Trump. And I don't see any signs that President Biden is going to rethink this approach should he be reelected at the end of this year. And former President Trump, who the last I checked is still running, even though he might be behind jail bars in November, is in favor of massive further increases of tariffs on Chinese products, and so I don't think we can count on him for delivering spontaneous relief on the U.S.-China trade front either.
Okay, good. Maybe last round. I don't know if China Daily or Beijing Daily was here. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm a business reporter from China Daily. I got 2 questions. My first question is, China has made progress in containing the risk of a debt deflation loop and increasing efforts to support housing inventory digestion. So how do you see those moves to stabilize the economy, and what efforts are needed to do more to bolster China's economic recovery or tackle some structural issues? And my second question is, actually, recently, China's top leadership has addressed the importance of deepening economic structural reforms, and so the plenary will be held in July with a key focus on reforms. So what will be the key policy focus for China to deepen economic reforms? Thank you.
What was the first one?
第一个问题是什么？你刚才说的第一个问题。
The first one?
Dealing with some structural issues like the property sector and
Okay,
what
okay,
else
okay,
should
sorry,
be more?
sorry. Yeah, the recent initiatives, I think, are steps in the right direction, but only steps. The property sector package is, I think, has the right focus aimed at absorbing the inventory overhang of unsold housing units, but the funding support, as announced by the People's Bank of China, is too small. If there's a lesson that we've learned from earlier housing property crises, whether they're Japan or the United States, is you need what we call a big bazooka. That means a big gun, a large package, err on the side of doing too much, not too little. This package is too little. It's incremental. It absorbs only a small portion of the overhang. It's going in the right direction, but it needs far more funding support to really make a major dent in the overhang of unsold housing units. In terms of the upcoming third plenum, I think the government has been very explicit in emphasizing, whether it's President Xi or Premier Li, the efforts on new productive forces, new technologies, and President Xi has, in fact, even indicated in a signed article late last year that his metric of success would be TFP. So that's very clear. What's not clear, though, is the second issue, one that Henry and I have both addressed, and that is to really deepen and expand the emphasis on supporting consumer-led rebalancing in China. Henry has some proposals on hukou reform and transferring ownership of rural residents. That is very important, and I support them. I have made recommendations for years on the social safety net, health care, and retirement. I think policies need to be formulated more explicitly and more comprehensively to address the shortfall of domestic household consumption in China. Without the Chinese consumer, I think economic growth is going to remain a big question mark in the years ahead. And the third plenum is the time to address that, and I would hope that more progress will be made in the upcoming reform agenda.
Great. So on that note, we have to conclude because our time has come to running out. And I really would like to, on behalf of Center for China and Globalization, thank Steve for this excellent presentation and exchanges and dialogue, and also with our participants. We have several ambassadors, we have many diplomats and international journalists, think tank scholars, so really a great exchange we had today. And of course, we're going to share this online and to our audience in China and outside China. And this is really a good occasion at this really timely exchange on those new MAGAM policies on China and economic development and China, China-U.S. relations. So as a top expert in this respect, we really appreciate your insights, your suggestions, your proposals, and your advice. So on behalf of all the audience here again, I'd like to thank you, and also I would like to give you a few books that CCG produced as token appreciation. We had a book from Graham Allison, from Joseph Nye, and also one of my books. So thank you for coming.